Wow, what a Grand Prix. What a win for Max in front of his home crowd at Zandvoort yet again. The race started in the dry, then it rained, then it became dry, and then it was wet right at the end. That was the basic climate of the race. The reality is that Max Verstappen went into this race on the pole in the best race car on the planet, but everything can still go wrong. It can't continue. How many Grand Prix is he going to win this year in a row? Things can happen in the first corner. The weather can change, all this can go on. And of course, the weather was going to change. There are a lot of predictions on the grid about when the rain was going to come. They're all on slicks, of course, on the soft tyre. All except Lewis Hamilton and I think one of the Haas's who started on the medium. But everybody else was on the slick, the red tyre, which you get a lot of laps out of. This is a very hard compound, remember, we had at Zandvoort. But lots of talk on the radio about how the rain was going to come. Most of the predictions said within 4 or 5, 6 laps. It wasn't really precise. They all got these maps, of course. They all got these green and red lights glowing for when the rain's going to come. All the strategists working overtime. But it came actually on the formation lap. You could see on the camera lenses, you could see spots of rain. And by the time the race actually started, it was starting to be greasy and they're all on slicks. And you thought, wow, this is going to be brilliant. And so it was. Max made a really good start, very clean start. But as he does, he's always quite conservative early on, particularly if he's leading anyone. He always tries to look after the tyres. He likes to be just quick enough to be in front, but not to be pushed into any sort of error. And that's what he did. But on this occasion, it was Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin, who we've been talking about all weekend, who's got this car that's beautifully balanced, very drivable. He has a lot of confidence in it. It wasn't full of grip on the soft red tyre in the dry, but in the semi-wet, the wet, and in race conditions, you could say, it was a very nice, chuckable Fernando Alonso-ish racing car. And on slicks, on a greasy track, Fernando was just reveling in it and all over Max, really. In the first couple of laps, he was catching Max to the point where Max was for sure feeling uncomfortable about it. But this is one of the great qualities of Max Verstappen. He's got this ability to put his head down and just do what he wants to do, which is, this is the pace I'm going to drive. Pass me at your peril. And then he makes no mistakes and starts to pull away. And the guy behind him, in this case Fernando, makes a slight mistake, just gets a little bit too much oversteer coming out of one of the slow corners or something like that. And all of a sudden there's a 10th, and then there's another 10th. And then Max pulls away. And that is, to some extent, the epitome of the art, this almost perfection of not making any mistakes. And that's what he did really, really well. So that was the first couple of laps. I say the first couple of laps, so that's important because with this rain now falling on the opening lap and cars sliding all over the place, certain teams and drivers, of course, made the call to come in on that lap to switch to intermediates. At the front of the race, neither Max nor Fernando did that. And it's understandable. Max is at the front, so he's controlling things, if you like, but he doesn't know what everybody else is doing. And he's got lots to lose. The team are saying, the rain's not going to stay for very long, Max. If you can do it, stay out there. Fernando's there feeling very good in the car, thinking, I might be able to get past Max here. It depends if I can get out of the circuit afterwards, of course, is another matter. And so they stay out. And I think that was understandable. But Sergio Perez, they brought Sergio in. Classic Red Bull. Let's split the options. We'll bring him in on that opening lap. And a number of other drivers did too, including Guanyu Zhou and Pierre Gasly in the Alpine. And those guys had a massive lift up as a result. Sergio Perez was immediately vaulted into the race lead when Max, the following lap, with the rain getting now much worse, came in, as did Fernando. And then he came out, and by then Sergio's leading the race, and he's got quite a significant advantage over Max Verstappen. So you're thinking, wow, maybe Sergio's going to win this Grand Prix. Okay, long way to go, but this is a serious leg up. This is better than getting the pole, if you like, given the way this race is going to go. So we'll see what happens to Sergio further down the road. And Fernando's looking good, but Pierre Gasly, Guanyu Zhou, right up there in the top 3 straight away. Guanyu Zhou, and then Pierre Gasly in the Alpine, who started P12. He too is suddenly running P3, P4, and suddenly enjoying it because he's on the wet, he's in intermediates. Gasly's always been good in the wet. We saw that in Formula 2. We saw that in Japanese Super Formula. We've seen glimpses of it in Formula 1. It's been a bit up and downish for him in terms of driving for AlphaTauri and then for Alpine in this first half season. It's been difficult to show that. But all of a sudden, he was in his zone. And this was Pierre Gasly thinking, right, brilliant, let's go for this one. So that we saw the best from Pierre Gasly from this moment onwards, I think. Guan Yu Zhou drove very well up there. And for a while, for a lap or two, George Russell was up there as well. He stayed out on slicks. Classic George, sliding all over the place. Unbelievable car control, sort of displaying what he can do. But eventually he had to come in after about 4 laps. We talk about, driver of the day, pass of the day. They should have moment of the day as well. And that for sure would have gone to George Russell. George is just incredible. He's just driving on reflexes all weekend, as far as I could see. There was a moment when Lewis was catching him. Lewis is on the soft tyre, going very well, sort of mid-race, 2/3 of the way through. And George is on this hard tyre, and it's getting a bit breathless, and he's starting to lose grip. And they're going through Shivlak, the very quick right-hander at the back of the circuit, before the first nude tight bit. And as they go in, obviously George is probably looking a little bit in his mirrors at Lewis catching him, and he turns into this right-hander. And we're talking 5th gear here, and the car just does that in 5th gear, and George does that, and then the car goes back that way, and you're on board with Lewis, and he just backs off, waiting for the accident, and George sort of keeps it all together. And we're talking 5th gear here. We're talking, I don't know, whatever that is, 145, 150 miles an hour. Very impressive to watch. So I give that moment of the day to George Russell. But then, Lewis's response was to say, "Oh, he's on a different strategy to me. I should be allowed to pass," or something like that. And he was going to get him anyway. A disappointing day for George Russell. But thank you, George, for all that display. Amazing finish. Max Verstappen then drove very well on intermediates, sort of scythed his way through the field up to P2 behind his teammate. I say behind, he was initially 5-6 seconds behind, and then he just very quickly caught Sergio Perez, but he didn't try to pass him. And fortuitously, if you like, for Red Bull, the track was now dry enough to bring them in for slick tyres. The track had been drying all this time, and that's what they did. They brought Max in first, and then Sergio the following lap, and the undercut gave him the lead. Guess what? That won't have gone down too well in Mexico, I'm sure. And as a result, Sergio was on the radio saying, "How did he get in front? Was that the undercut?" Kind of saying, "Why did you give him the undercut?" I suppose in brackets. And whether or not that was planned by Red Bull as a way of Max getting the lead, or whether that's just the way it worked out and Max pushed the issue there, I don't know, on the basis that if it was still a little bit greasy, he was happy to be on slick tyres while it was greasy, whereas with Sergio, you want to make sure the track's pretty dry. Whether it was that or the other, I don't know. But certainly it was a very, very good move by Max, and that took him into the lead, and then he just gradually pulled away. Did his usual thing, 10th here, 10th there, and just pulled out. Fernando Alonso got back up through the field as well after his stop on the second lap. Not the same advantage that Sergio Perez had right at the beginning. And again, just looked very strong, very, very impressive in the Aston Martin, reasonably quick in a straight line as well. And that made it really nice for Fernando to do lots of DRS passes going into turn 1. And he very quickly got up to 3rd place. He wasn't going to be able to pass Sergio Perez, but he was there or thereabouts within 3 seconds of Sergio, always in the mirrors, always just that flash of green in the mirror, enough for Sergio to think, can't make any mistakes, got to keep the head down, got to do the job. A lot of pressure on him from Fernando. A very good drive. And Fernando ahead of the McLarens, the Mercedes, Gasly, he had them all, the Ferraris, until eventually, 12 laps from the end of the race, the rain returned. This time the predictions were really accurate, and the teams were saying the rain is going to be heavier than it was at the start. And there was lots of discussion on various radios about whether they go to wets or to extreme wets or to intermediates. Again, Red Bull brought Sergio Perez in first for intermediates, and he went out, and on the track now wet, on intermediates, he locked up solid going into turn 1 into Tarzan, and took the escape road and came back in. And as he came back into the pit lane, he then crunched the pit wall on the right, trying to stop the car before the timing light, and went over at 60.8 kilometers an hour, 0.8 over the limit, and got himself a 5-second fine. So you could say messy end to the race for Sergio Perez, I'm afraid, very messy. This penalty has to be seen in the perspective of a similar 5-second penalty given to Pierre Gasly when he came in And guess what? He was over the speed limit by zero 0.1 of a kilometre an hour. 60.1, 5-second penalty. 60.8, 5-second penalty. I suppose you could say, it says, oh, if you're over the line, you're over the line. Doesn't matter how much. And so they had to eat that in the pit stop. And as a result, it was kind of ironic, I guess, or balanced, whatever it is. I don't know. Kind of balanced out, I suppose, that Sergio beat Pierre Gasly on the road to the checkered flag, and yet Pierre was within 5 seconds of Sergio and got that P3 as a result. And it's good that Formula One these days immediately gives the results taking that timing into account. And you see on the readout that Pierre Gasly's third, even though he's fourth on the road. Time was when you'd celebrate on the podium with a driver who was P3. And then 2 hours later, of course, you'd realise that that wasn't the driver that finished third at all. Those days seem to be over. Touch wood, kind of. Anyway, now we're in the red zone in the pit lane, and Max is there. He's made 2 stops actually right at the end, first for intermediates, and he came in again for wets when it was really, really wet, and he still would have been in the lead doing that. That gives you an idea of the sort of margin he had, particularly with all the stuff going on with Sergio. But now he had Fernando to worry about behind him in the pit lane at the restart, and they led, and so he led the field out behind the rolling start restart. And I thought this was a bit strange, I got to say, because the ruling came out that everybody would have to restart on intermediate tyres. Now, it had been really wet. It was there was a lot of aquaplaning. Lewis had a lock-up, didn't hit anything. Guanyu Zhou went off. Several others had lock-ups as well. And I thought it was kind of strange when they said everybody must restart on intermediates. The track was drying quickly, the rain had stopped, and I think most drivers would have chosen to start on intermediates anyway, because there were 5 full racing laps to go, 2 behind the safety car as well. But I found it kind of odd that they would even have that rule at all, because as far as I can remember, this came into Formula One, I think it was the 2007 Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji, the first time the FIA said it was a rolling start in the rain, and you had to start on full wets. Ferrari got it wrong, I think. Kimi Raikkonen started on intermediates or something like that and got a penalty. But I can understand that, because that was very wet conditions, and they didn't want anybody being a hero starting on intermediates and aquaplaning off and having a shunt. And that makes sense to me. But it doesn't make sense when the track is drying, it's still wet, and some drivers out there might have wanted to have started on extreme wets to make a good start, and maybe to pick up a couple of places on the first couple of laps and then look after the deg over the final 2 or 3 laps, take a little bit of a gamble, add a bit of spice to the race. Why wouldn't they have allowed anyone to do that? Didn't make sense to me. I suppose the only thing I can think of is that Pirelli had said, we don't want to use up all the wets on this sort of sprint. We'll save them, make everybody start on intermediates. Maybe it was that. They had more intermediates there than wets. In which case, I kind of go along with it, because if that's what Pirelli want, fair enough. But it seemed odd to me that with the track drying, they're telling everybody they had to run intermediates. Why take that choice away? Anyway, they went out, and Max, it was very similar to the early 2 laps of the race when they were on slicks, because Max was on intermediates. He made a good start, but Fernando made a good start as well on the rolling start. He started to catch him coming out of the banking. And coming into turn 1, he was sort of like this and all over him. And Max, again, did his thing. He's just driving as slowly as he can possibly drive in the first couple of laps, just to get the temperature in the tyres and the brakes, get everything right. And looking after his braking areas and making sure everything's feeling good. But Fernando's all over him. And you're thinking, he's not far away from making a pass, as indeed he was at the start of the race. But again, Max did what he does, and he just started to pull away, and he won that race beautifully. He won it, the classic Fangio, Jack Brabham way, the slowest possible way of winning the race. He still did it, and he did it with complete margin. It looked as if it was complete margin. Although Fernando did set fastest lap, not obviously in this section, but when just after he put new tyres on and before the rain came, and Max was still out on the old tyres, and that's when Fernando got his fastest lap. So from Fernando's point of view, P2 and fastest lap. After a bit of a slump by Aston Martin, coming right back into it on a day where all the variables with which Fernando likes to play were there, except for one. It seemed as if his front wing end plates or other parts of the side pod were in one piece. It looked as if he didn't hit anything, because I'm assuming that if he'd lost a front wing end plate on lap 1, corner 1, he would have been even quicker. That's what Fernando does, being facetious, of course. And so we go then to Monza, to the great park there, where there's a PGA golf course as well, to see whether Max Verstappen, having equaled the number of consecutive wins at Red Bull, 9 by Sebastian Vettel, whether he can then score a 10th unprecedented win at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. See you then.